Good evening, everyone. Oh, you're going to make me take my jacket off already, are you? Let's try it again, Pittsburgh. Good evening, everyone. All right. It's such an honor and a blessing to be here with you. First of all, could we give a round of applause to the mayor and to Grant and all the folks who pulled this together? Y'all probably heard my name. Y'all said, I don't know what's about to come from behind the curtain. But it is fantastic to be here with each and every one of you. Having the opportunity to talk a little bit about environmental justice, clean economies, future cities, and the directions that we need to head to make real change happen. But change that is inclusive. Change that actually makes sure that all of the voices have the opportunity to help frame out a new direction. Change where no one has to get left behind. And that's when we start to begin to have the conversation around environmental justice. Now, I should share with everyone that I was born and raised in a family of Baptist and Pentecostal ministers. By a show of hands, how many people in here know somebody who's Baptist or Pentecostal? Okay, because some places I go, they act like that is, something they never saw before. And the interesting thing with that is that, and probably 1,000 presentations that I've given, I often talk about my mother and my grandmother, and they are the rocks that I stand on. And when I was a real young boy, my mother told me, she said, son, you're going to have some tough days. By a show of hands, how many folks in the room have ever had a hard day? Raise your hand. Everybody look around. Run over and touch that person never had a hard day. Just run over and touch them real quick. Because, when we work on many of the issues that I know the folks here in this room are focused on, whether it is environmental justice, civil rights, social justice issues, you might be a planner who's trying to do the right thing, an architect who's trying to make sure that that new design actually is going to be beneficial for communities. Then sometimes there are those tough days. We're trying to make change happen. We're trying to make sure the voice of communities is a part of the process and to move paradigms and shift them in the right direction. So that's why it was so important when my mother shared those words with me. And at the time I was young, and when we're young, sometimes we don't pay as much attention to our parents or our grandparents as we should. But as I began to get a little bit older, and those words came back to me every day since I've been 16 years old, I've got up in the morning and said these words of empowerment. Every morning I get up and I say, I'm blessed and highly favored. I don't know why they gave this to me because I have no idea what to do with this, but that's all right. I want y'all to try it with me. I'm blessed. We'll try one more time since. Hang on, let's give her a round of applause. She did a fantastic job, didn't she? Okay. Yeah, I got it. All right. So what you're going to see is there are going to be some photos that are going to be rolling behind me as I speak. And it will help you to have a better understanding also of some of the historical things that have happened around environmental justice. But we will also talk about some of the opportunities that still exist. And we're also going to have some real talk, because if you are going to talk about future cities, then we have to address these disproportionate impacts that continue to happen. If we don't do that, then we're leaving gaps in our process that will leave us without what we are hoping to achieve at the end of this process. So going back to those words of empowerment, I am not going to let y'all get away without saying them. I may have to come down here in the audience. So y'all try it with me one more time. I'm blessed and highly favored. Now, this is the city of the Steelers, Franco Harris, Mean Joe Green, Rocky Blyer, a number of other folks. This is the city of Willie Stargell, Omar Marino, and a number of others. So I know y'all got some energy inside of you. So let's try it again. I'm blessed and highly favored. See, y'all should have never invited me. Now, you didn't know what you was getting into. When we begin to talk about environmental justice, there are a number of different ways for us to approach this. If we're going to have real talk, there have been injustices that have been happening to a number of our groups since we first came to these shores. If we look at African Americans in the slave trade, we know that when folks came, they were placed on plantations, in many instances pushed off to the side, moved away from their traditional foods, and all the other types of dynamics that go into that space. If we look at our indigenous brothers and sisters, removed from their traditional lands, again, placed in places that were not suitable to continue to be able to support their culture. And we can also look at, when we talk about infrastructure, we can look at our Asian American brothers and sisters from China who helped to build our railroads, many of those railroads that run not too far from where we are today. Or we can move forward to Dr. King in 1968 in Memphis, and we just celebrated 50 years of him leaving us, but also remembering the incredible work that he did and how he was focused on the sanitation workers and helping them to get better jobs and safer working opportunities as well. And we can look at here in Pittsburgh, when we had folks who left the South coming to Pittsburgh looking for a better opportunity, trying to escape Jim Crowism and a number of other things. So we have these opportunities to think about how, when we don't listen to the voice of communities, how we can miss what folks are really looking for us to be able to do. Or you saw a picture from Warren County, North Carolina. You saw the folks who were laying there on the roads as people were not listening to them when they were trying to move those cancer-causing chemicals into their communities. And we understand the impacts that are there. And when we actually have an opportunity to engage with people, real change can happen. Now, I want you all to think about something as you see some of these photos that are going by. As we are trying to redevelop, revitalize, and build new cities, we have to make sure that we are addressing some of these impacts that are happening. I want you all to do me a favor, because I ran track in college, and everything in my head moves in seconds. So in the last 60 seconds, how many folks in the room have taken a breath of air? Everybody look around. Raise your hand if you took a breath of air. Everybody look around. Find that non-air breather. We need to know who's here. Now, it seems like a silly question, doesn't it? Because it's an autonomic response. It's something that we just naturally do. But I want you to think about all of the folks in our country who unfortunately can't take a breath of fresh air. Everybody do me a favor. Take a deep breath in. Let it out, because I heard somebody about to pass out. Let it out, let it out, let it out, let it out. In our country, right now, we have 140 million people who live in areas with unhealthy air quality, where ozone impacts their communities. In our country, some would label us as the greatest country on the planet, depending on how you evaluate that. We know that 200,000 people lose their lives prematurely because of air pollution. In our country. In our country. We also know that we have 25 million people who suffer from asthma. By a show of hands, how many folks in this room know somebody who has asthma? Everybody look around, because that's the seriousness of the moment. We have 7 million kids in our country who also suffer from asthma. And we know disproportionately African American and Latino children are the ones who end up in the emergency rooms, and unfortunately are the ones who also often lose their lives. So it's an interesting time that we live in, and I'm not going to get too political, but there are some folks who have been making some decisions around air protections. You all know that we have folks who are trying to roll back the Clean Power Plan. How many folks know what the Clean Power Plan is? Let's see. Everybody knows about that. Trying to make sure that we're keeping carbon and other things out of our atmosphere and some of those co-pollutants that unfortunately are some of the elements that impact many of our most vulnerable communities and impact our country as a whole. And we have to do something about that. So when we're talking about building new cities, resilient cities, then we have to address those issues, and we have to make sure that the voices of our most vulnerable communities have an opportunity to play a significant role in that process. In some of the pictures that were rolling behind me, you saw places like the Manchester community in Houston, Texas. Now, when you go to the Manchester community, if you roll down your windows, if you have an old car, because I know none of y'all got windows that still roll down, and you take that first breath of air in, you feel like you're literally breathing in gasoline fumes in our country. And the other dynamic that happens in that space is that when people talk about frontline communities, and many of you work on those issues as well, this is an example that probably ranks up in the top 10 in our country, because when you go sit on people's back porches, they can literally reach their hands out and touch the piping in the facilities that are right there in their community. But yet we have folks who are trying to move forward on the refinery rule and the methane rule and a number of these other rules that are out there that are meant to help to protect folks, to give them a fighting chance. And that's one of the reasons that we have to be sort of engaged in this, because we can't build resilient cities, we can't build new cities if we still have folks who are struggling in that space. In the last 24 hours, how many folks in the room have taken a drink of water? Or a beverage, excuse me. Keep your hands up. Everybody look around. We only got like 2 or 3 camels that are in here right now. You know, it's interesting in our country that, you know, when we turn on the tap, we expect for there to be clean, fresh water to come out. We pay our taxes to make sure that that happens. But unfortunately, we have hundreds and hundreds of millions of gallons of raw sewage that moves into our water body systems. When we talk about water-related issues, and we'll talk a little bit about Pittsburgh here in a second, if I say Flint, Michigan, how many folks in the room don't know what happened in Flint, Michigan? Everybody look around. Every person in this room understands some of the dynamics that happened in that place. Here's the interesting thing, is that we have over 1,000 communities that have higher levels of lead than in Flint, Michigan. And we know the challenges that existed and continue to exist in Flint, Michigan. We also know that lead is an issue that you are still dealing with here in Pittsburgh, trying to get your arms around it and trying to make some decisions that will be more protective of kids and communities. And the dynamic in Flint was that so many kids were impacted, and it also connects to all of you and everybody else in this country. Because in that dynamic, when young children are exposed to lead, we know that it leads to neurological disorders. And we know that when you have that situation that's going on, it makes it difficult to learn. And when you can't learn in this competitive environment that we all now live in, then you're not going to probably be able to get a job. And if you can't get a job, then you may make some other decisions. So we know that if we get in front of this problem, we have over 1 million kids in our country who unfortunately have been exposed to lead pollution. We know that if we can get in front of it, we can save literally billions of dollars. And if we don't, we also know the impacts that will happen in that space. Right down the road in West Virginia, where I was raised partially, we also know not that long ago that we had a pollution spill in the Elk River and the dynamics that went on there, where folks were not only afraid to drink the water afterwards, but are still struggling to be able to get back to a place where they have some confidence in that space. And that's another reason that we have to work on these issues so incredibly diligently to make real change happen. Now, I know also here, as we're beginning to think about the region and how we move forward on economic opportunities, that there's also some pipeline issues that are going on. And we know that there are some jobs that are associated with that. But how many folks in the room knew that we have over 2 million miles of pipeline in our country? And most folks understand that what's moving through there is oil and gas. And you saw a picture from a place called Port Arthur, Texas. Now, for you all who don't know, Port Arthur, Texas actually has the pipelines that run from Canada all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And when you get there, the interesting dynamic there is that you have a huge amount of refineries that are there. And the other dynamic is, many of you remember the hurricanes that came through not that long ago. And they came through both the Manchester community in Houston, Texas, but they also came to Port Arthur, Texas. And you'll probably see a picture of the water that was rising there, and also folks having to deal with the plants shutting down as the storms were coming and people were trapped, breathing in those emissions, and then after being displaced, trying to find an opportunity to come back home. These are some of the dynamics that we currently have going on that we have to address. We have to make sure that people's voices are leading us in a direction to make real change happen, and for us to be able to actually hear what needs to happen. So I was backstage and people were talking to me about the economic opportunities that folks are focused on here in Pittsburgh. And we know that renewables are one of these set of opportunities that will allow us to help many communities to get their voice, to get the opportunities that are necessary for them to get that strong foundation underneath of them. And you saw some of the slides that went through about some of the new, fastest growing businesses that are out there. So we know that we have a couple million new jobs that are going to be created underneath of solar. We know that we have the same thing in relationship to wind opportunities and advanced manufacturing. So those are some of the ways that we will be able to help folks in West Virginia, to be able to help folks in other locations throughout Appalachia and in the Rust Belt, and a number of other places that are going on. And there are some other tools that folks are also sharing to help to push back against the current administration, who hasn't been as supportive of what we're trying to do. So I would be remiss if I didn't raise divestment. We have to begin to think about divestment and reinvestment. So moving those resources in those portfolios, not only away from fossil fuels, but how do we better reinvest those dollars so that they make real change happen? And how do we better engage folks around their own personal choices with their investments to help us to move forward on this new green economy that we're talking about? So people often ask me, well, what does environmental justice look like when we're able to address some of these issues? So I want to share one example with you all, and then I'll talk a little bit about the Hip Hop Caucus. So I want to talk to you about a place called Spartanburg, South Carolina. How many folks have ever been to Spartanburg? Oh, this is fantastic. We got about 30, 40 people in here. Spartanburg, South Carolina is not that much different than many of our communities across the country. They have some of the same challenges. So one of the projects that we had was the Regenesis Project. How many folks have ever heard of the Regenesis Project? So we had one hand that went up. So the Regenesis Project, folks got a $20,000 environmental justice small grant. And in this community, they had bad transportation routes. So they also had a chemical plant there at one time and a train track. So if you drove into this part of the town and the train decided to come through, you would be stuck there for a considerable amount of time. And they also had brownfields and Superfund sites that were on this side of the community. They also had a lack of opportunity for health care. How many folks in here deal with food justice issues? So we have a couple of folks who deal with food justice issues. So they had that as well, where the supermarket, folks had to travel a distance to get there, lack of access to health care. And they also had shotgun housing. How many folks in the room know what shotgun housing is? We want to see how many people from the South. Okay. So you open the front door and you can see out the back door, right? No energy efficiency or very little energy efficiency inside of those. So the dynamic was that the community said, we've got some real impacts in our community, but we're also looking for opportunities. We want to frame out a new direction. They took that $20,000 environmental justice small grant and leveraged it almost $300 million in changes. So what does that look like now? How does that translate to Homewood? How does that translate to the Hill District? How does that translate to East Liberty? Well, now they have 500 new green homes. So before, folks were paying $300 to $400 a month for their electricity cost. With the new green homes, we've now got that down to $67 a month. So that's more disposable income in people's pockets. They have new transportation routes, so we work with the railroads so that they no longer sat there and idled. And we also got new beautification programs in place there as well. We also got a new supermarket in, which has now become an anchor, and other businesses are now moving into that space as well. We got a 50,000 square foot new green community center where seniors and children can come and learn, and culture can be honored in that space. And we have worker training programs that have been a part of it. So the community residents are the ones who went through the worker training programs, and they are the ones who rebuilt this community. Now, y'all remember we said there were brownfields and Superfund sites, right? So in those brownfield and Superfund sites that are now been cleaned up, there's a 35-acre solar farm that's going in that will now zero out the cost of electricity, and the rebate from that will now go back to the community. That's how you build power inside of a community. And they also looked at the political structures that were in place. And what they did was they said, well, we don't have anyone who's a champion for us in this process. So they got folks to run for office who are on the city council. They got folks on the county commission, and eventually they got someone in the state house. And that's how we begin to shift the paradigm of making sure that the voices of community are a driver in the process and that real change can happen. The other way, as we begin to move forward, is to make sure that culture is a much stronger player in this overall process. That's one of the reasons that I went to the Hip Hop Caucus, is because of the cultural aspect. So let me ask you guys something. I could probably put 1,000 scientists in front of you here, and you probably would remember about 10% of what they said. But if I put Beyonce in front of you, how many of y'all gonna pull out your phones? Raise your hands if you're gonna pull out your phone. Exactly. Or if I brought, Jay-Z or whoever yell out who your favorite artist is. I don't care who it is. Everybody yell it out. I don't know what you just said. But it's important that we are also honoring that culture and utilizing it. And it's just incredible when the artists begin to really engage on these issues and move the ball forward. And it can also help as we're beginning to think about revitalizing our communities, that they are also playing a role. And they don't have to be folks who you see on TV. Cultural leaders can be the person who owns the beauty shop or the barber shop and the beauty salon, or it could be a local poet. There's so many different folks, but we have to make sure that their voice is a part of the process. So I know that many folks in the room probably have been sort of dealing with some concerns with the folks that we currently have running things in Washington. But I want to share with you this before I close out. I want you all to think about the fact that people will often tell us that we don't have power. I want you to think about the Women's March. People said that 1 million women would never come together. And women and sisters and others said, oh yeah, I got something for you. And 1 million women came together. We had the Science March, and people said scientists will never come out their labs. Now, I was there, and let me tell you something. They didn't have a whole lot of rhythm. The left-right thing, maybe that's why some of us needed to help them out. But the interesting thing is that not only did they come out, but they took that energy, and then they translated it into making sure that they were doing pro bono work, that they were giving back in communities, that they were helping communities to understand the information that was going on in their communities that they no longer could go to the federal family to garner. We see that same energy that continues to happen with the People's Climate March, with Black Lives Matter, with the Me Too movement, all of these folks coming together and saying that real change can actually happen. Y'all do me a favor. Look to the person to your right, your other right. Look to the person to your left. Boy, some of y'all mad. Y'all just staring like crazy. It is good. Reach your right hand out to the person on your right-hand side. We're going to see if you actually know your right from your left. Reach your left hand out to the person on your left. All right, let's see how much ability. So everybody try and stand up. Let's see if you can actually stand up. All right. I want you all to think about something. Dr. King once said that we come to these shores on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. I want you to think about the time that we're living in and the situations that we have to deal with. And as we're going to move forward on building equitable and resilient and new cities, how important it's going to be for us to come together. But we also have to come together in honoring the voices of our most vulnerable communities, communities of color, low-income communities, and indigenous populations. I heard Grant say that, referencing black folks in the future, we have to make sure that we understand that the new future has to be inclusive of all of us, but also that we have power for the change that needs to happen. Y'all do me a favor. Everyone say power. See, y'all didn't believe what you just said. We're going to try it again. Everybody say power. All right. I want y'all one last time. Put your right hand in the air. I'm going to let it get good to you. Let it sink in real deep. We have a 1968 at the Olympics moment. I want y'all to say power in a way that folks in Washington, D.C. say, what in the world just happened? Everybody say power. I'm Mustafa Santiago Ali. Thank you all for a few moments of your time.
Mustafa, you have time for a quick question?
Sure. Yep.
So we had the opportunity, Mustafa and I, to do a recording for our podcast, We Can Be, right before this started. And I also had an opportunity to speak with Angela Blanchard, who's here as well. One of the more inspiring afternoons I've had, but you told some stories that were really compelling. And since I opened with a reference to Alicia Wormsley's art, you and I talked a little bit about why art matters and why story matters in the context of social change. Would you just say something quickly about what you shared with me?
Sure. I mean, art, music, culture is the bridge. It is what connects us. It's what makes us human in a sense. And it gives us the opportunity to move past our isms. It gives us a chance to break down the silos that unfortunately sometimes exist and sometimes folks want to build up. And it is who we are. So for me, culture is a driving force. Art is a driving force. It is what we look for and what we aspire to be. And it gives us the chance to make real change happen. It's what, when you go to sleep at night, you hear something sometimes, whether it's in your spirit, in your soul, in your mind, you hear that song, you hear that poem, you remember that special picture or mural that someone put together. It helps us to be our better selves.
I was going to ask you how you knew that, but you're right. So, this is the town that Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, came from, and one of the things he always liked to invite people to do was to think for a moment about who helped them along their way. And part of what you and I spoke with was what shaped you and a couple of people in your family who helped give you the set of values that guide you now. And I think a good way for us to go out of here and into the reception, which will immediately follow, and which I hope you will all stay for and take a moment to chat and talk and break bread together as we prepare for tomorrow and think about the agenda that we'll be covering tomorrow. But I think a great way to end is the tribute that you paid to your mom and your dad, and just share with us a little bit about who you are in terms of how it shaped you.
I'm a country boy. Nobody believes me. My mother and my dad, are my inspirations. My mom is a fierce warrior for change, but also for pulling people together. I was sharing with Grant earlier that if you came to our house for Thanksgiving, you never knew who was going to be around the table, because my mom would literally go out and pull people off the street. She would go to homeless shelter. She would go wherever she thought someone might need a meal. And she would bring them in so that they knew there was a place where they were safe, and that they were loved, that they were valued and appreciated. And it actually was ingrained in me that those are the same things that communities are looking for. They want to know that they are valued, that their experiences, that their innovation is honored, but not only honored, but, is going to be a part of the process. So I'm very, very thankful to my mom and my grandmother and my dad, to the environmental justice leaders who raised me, and civil rights and social justice leaders and others who really get that. And that's what we're all pushing toward. And I'm hoping that when we talk about these new cities, these vibrant, resilient cities, that we will remember to honor the voices and experiences of all of our folks and make sure that they're not left behind or forgotten. When we talk about moving folks with renewable energy, let's remember that it's okay to have renewable energy, but if you can't afford it, then that's going to create its own set of dynamics. So, as I was sharing with you, my grandfather used to pull me onto the porch when folks would come from the various counties around to hear him talk about and strategize on issues. And he had a little small apple orchard. And he used to have this bag of apples. And he would peel those apples and he would cut them in little slices. And I would sit by his knee. And every time he wanted to reinforce a lesson, he would give me one of those slices of the apple. I was joking with Grant that maybe it was Pavlovian that he was trying to do some things. I'm not sure. But those lessons stick. And I hope that those of us who are in positions to be able to influence the direction that our country is going, that will remember those life lessons from the movements that we have witnessed in this movement that we are developing. We'll remember the women's suffrage movement and how women had to struggle for equal rights and are still looking for that to be fully in place. For the lessons of the civil rights movement of how easy it is for us to take our eye off the ball and for injustice to continue to grow. So I'm thankful to my grandparents. I'm thankful to my mom and my dad and all those others who shared those lessons.
Great. Thank you. And we're thankful for what you've shared with us.
Oh, thank you, brother.
Thank you. One more expression of thanks, please, for the incredible Mustafa Ali.